Good morning. Richard Blackaby here. Welcome to the Tuesday morning devotional being held on Wednesday morning today. Just want to kind of make sure that you were still paying attention. Sorry for that. We had a whole day of meetings yesterday that had been committed for a while, and so we just tried to move it a day later. But I wanted just to alert you as we begin today that we're going to have another book giveaway as we always do. And this week it's it's actually I think my wife's favorite book that I've written. It's called Putting a Face on Grace. And lots of just fun stories. And there's a lot of people actually who have gone through this as a Bible study. It's written as a book, but it's got study guides and questions. And I'll be unpacking this a little bit later. So as usual, if you submit a question that I answer, and get to before the time is done, we'll put your name in a hat and we'll send you this book. It's a fun read. My wife, some of her favorite stories are in here, so we'll do that. And also, just want to remind you or let you know that our ministry offers some online study classes, and it's a great group of people from around the world that jump in. Had over 50 people in the last class from all over the country and the world. And we're going to be starting a new class in June, and it's going to be based on the first book I ever wrote called When God Speaks. And of all the subjects that you ought to know and ought to be familiar with, it ought to be how to recognize when God is speaking. And so this is just a 6-week course, and you can see the notes in the chat section of this broadcast. If you'd like to go over and take a look at the website for Blackaby Ministries, it tells you how to register and so on. Has a little blurb from me about that. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to do that. I interact, and as my son Daniel does as well, with the class participants. And there's some videos that you watch, and you have a chat discussion with other students. It's quite a lot of fun. We've already got a number of people signed up, and so if you've never done that before, it's a great way to get your feet wet in an online class. So When God Speaks, coming up in just a couple of weeks here in June. It's not too late to sign up if you'd be interested in doing that. Well, as you know, I travel a lot. I've been grounded for the last while. I've had, I think, 24 trips canceled so far because of COVID, and so I've been housebound. But normally, I'm on the road quite a bit. And I remember one of my famous trips took place while I still lived in Canada, and I had to fly from Canada down to Houston, which was over a 4-hour flight from the Calgary airport, and then I had to go over to Jackson, Mississippi. And so I'd gotten up early that morning, flown down to Houston, was exhausted, got to my gate, was waiting for them to board, and the gate area is getting quite crowded with people. There weren't enough seats for everybody, so people were standing around kind of waiting. And then all of a sudden they make an announcement that there's some mechanical difficulty with our plane, and so they decided to change the flight of the plane, and it's at a different gate. And so everybody has to pick up their stuff, move to another gate, and not everybody's quite happy about this. And so we get to the next gate and get settled in and everything. We're waiting and watching for when we're going to start boarding, and then a little bit time passes, and then they make another announcement. And this time they said that there's another technical problem, and they're going to move us a second time. I've never had that happen before. And so we have to move to another part of the airport, another gate, and people are now very unhappy. And I'm listening to people grumpily getting after their kids, and couples arguing with one another, and people just muttering under their breath. It's turning into an unruly mob. And then right when you think it can't get any worse, you can hear the crackle of the intercom system, and everybody stops and braces themselves, because we're thinking surely there's not going to be more problems or more delays at this point. And but this time the announcement actually is for me. Only the person announces on the intercom system loud enough for everybody in the entire seating area and that side of the airport to hear. The person said, "Would a Richard Blackbaby come to the ticket counter?" Now, my name is an English name. If you speak English and you take a moment to read my name before you broadcast it through an entire airport, you should be able to see that it's pronounced Black B. but I've just been called Richard Black Baby through the whole airport. So I hop up and come up to the counter, and I said, I'm Richard Black B. I said, were you calling for me? They said, could we see your boarding pass? I thought, are they going to argue with me about how my name should be pronounced? So I hand them my boarding pass, and she takes it, looks at it, and rips it in two, and then says, we need your seat. I thought to myself, I didn't think things could get any worse, but apparently they can. And then they give me this little grin and said, we're going to have to move you up into business class. Well, all of a sudden, it was as if the sun burst back out in the sky. I could have sworn I heard birds singing. It was glorious. In fact, as I walked away, I said, that's Richard Black Baby at your service. God bless us, everyone. It was things had just kind of been changed for me. And after a few moments, they announced that people in business class could go ahead and be seated. So I scurried on board and sat down in my nice leather seat. And we had a delightful flight attendant who immediately came up and asked what I could get to drink. And I mean, I was having a great time. I'd had a bottle of water, a cup of coffee, and a soft drink before we'd even taxied out to the runway. And then all the riffraff start boarding the plane and moving to the back. And I'm just really enjoying this experience. And then we take off, and the flight attendant came, and we actually had a menu. I mean, there's food choices. They're not just, do you want stale pretzels or no stale pretzels? It was there was actually some salmon that I could have, and or there was like sirloin, I think, of some choice at that point, and it's delightful. Well, what I noticed is after I got through that little rigmarole of upgrade, they did the same thing to a woman, and they called the woman up, and I noticed them ripping her ticket up. Someone just had this sadistic sense of humor, and she'd also been upgraded. She was sitting across from me, but she was not having nearly as much fun as I was having. They asked if she'd like coffee, and she'd asked what kind it was. They said it was Starbucks. And she immediately got grumpy and said, "Oh, I hate that Starbucks. Do you have anything else?" And they said, "Well, no, but can we get you some tea?" Well, what kind of tea do you have? And every kind of tea they had, she didn't like. And then she wanted some kind of alcoholic drink, but they didn't have some of the mix that she liked, and she was just getting grumpier and grumpier by the second. And so when it came time to lunch, she ordered the fish like I had, and it's just a rule of thumb with me. If you're having a bad day, don't order fish. It's just not going to work out well for you. But she ordered the fish, and sure enough, now I'm kind of spying on her at this point because she's given this poor flight attendant just a really hard time. She bites into her fish and spews it out, like spits it out on her tray. Says, "Oh, this is terrible." And she wants it taken away, and the poor flight attendant spends the entire flight trying to pacify this woman. Well, I knew that she had been upgraded, that she was just like me, that she had not paid to be sitting up there. She didn't really deserve to be sitting in business class. She deserved to be in the back, behind the veil, with all the riffraff. But she had been fortunate enough to be moved up into a class she hadn't paid for. And she had this wonderful flight attendant doing everything he could to help, but she was just miserable all the same. And as I watched that, it just dawned on me that there are many Christians who are just like that woman. There's times I've been like that woman, where if you're a Christian, you've been upgraded. You had one destination you were headed toward, and God radically upgraded your destination. You were going through life on your own, trying to just make the best of life that you could. Now you've got the Holy Spirit constantly coming to your life and bringing all the resources of heaven to you to help you experience joy and abundant living and success. You were trying to go through life alone, and now you're part of a fellowship of believers that will walk with you and help you and pray for you. Life has been upgraded in so many ways if you're a Christian, and yet there's still a lot of Christians who have a sense of entitlement, who don't seem to appreciate all that God has done for them, who are still miserable despite everything that God has given them. And there's a wonderful story that talks about that. And I want to just look at that for a moment. It's found in Matthew chapter 18. And it's one of those stories that is kind of challenging in some ways. And so Matthew 18, beginning of verse 21, it says, Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Now you have to understand that in the Middle East, the normal going rate was 0. The philosophy was, if you hurt me, I'm going to hurt you twice as bad. Otherwise, you're going to think you can just hurt me anytime you want to. So I'm going to just retaliate so badly upon you that you're going to leave me alone. You're not going to try to bother me anymore. And of course, that's why there's such hatred and unforgiveness and violence in the Middle East right to this very day. That kind of mindset. But the going rate among the Jewish rabbis at that time was 3. They had said, look, if you just retaliate every solitary time someone offends you, you're just going to have blood feuds all the time. So let's just agree that you have to forgive 3 times. So if someone offends you, you can't just go out there and punch them. You can't go out and steal their camel. You can't hurt them back. You got to forgive them. And if they offend you a 2nd time, you have to forgive them. You've got to do it 3 times. But if that person is foolish enough to keep pushing your buttons, even after you've forgiven them 3 times, then that 4th time, you have every right to just let them have it right between the eyes. And there's some people probably just hoping, just offend me 1 more time. I'm finally at number 4. I can do what I've wanted to do all this time. And so Peter is actually being quite generous. He says up to 7 times. And in other words, Peter is more than doubling the going rate. Peter's expecting Jesus to say, wow, Peter, the going rate's only 3, and you're offering to forgive 7 times. Good for you. But of course, what does Jesus say? Not 3 times, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. In other words, Peter, there is no limit. And what I think Peter was trying to do is what a lot of us have tried to do with God, and that is to say, God, just tell me where the line is. Tell me what the limit is. How good do I have to be? When can I stop? And I've had many people over the years ask the question, well, do you have to forgive for this? Or, well, can you forgive someone when they don't even think they've done anything wrong? When they don't even think they need forgiveness? Can you forgive someone who's never said they're sorry? Can you forgive someone if they're being abusive and harmful and being a jerk to you? I mean, at some point, can't you just not forgive anymore? And many Christians ask that question. Where's the limit? Where's the line? And that's what Peter was asking. And what Jesus basically says is there is no line. You just keep forgiving. And then he tells a parable. And if I just maybe summarize the parable for you, and by the way, Jesus was always telling stories. And I've had there's some folks who kind of feel almost as if you're not really preaching if you tell a story. It's somehow not spiritual if in a Bible study you tell a story. But Jesus told stories all the time. And it's because it helped understand this spiritual truth. So he tells a story, and he says that a king discovered basically that what his chief steward was stealing from him, and so he comes and this man has basically, he owes him 10,000 talents. Now you need to understand that in this day, if you earned 1 denarius, that was considered a day's wages. And so if you worked all day long, you'd be paid 1 denarius. That was equal to a day's wages. Well, a talent would have been worth at least 6,000 denarii. So basically, every talent would have been worth 6,000 days' wages. Well, he owed 10,000 talents. That would have worked out to about at least 60 million days' wages. Now, you don't just accidentally go into debt 60 million days' wages. You've got to be robbing your boss blind to get into that kind of debt. And so here this guy has been shamelessly stealing from his boss, and he gets caught, and he gets brought before the king. He's got no defense. He doesn't say that there's been a mistake. This is not true. I want a lawyer. There's no defense. He's caught red-handed. He doesn't deny the charge at all. But in verse 26, it says, the servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. Well, of course, this man doesn't have 60 million days left to earn to pay back everything he owes. It's impossible. The whole point of Jesus' parable is that the man owes so much, it's absolutely beyond his means to pay that kind of debt back. And so, to his amazement, the master forgives him and just says, your debt is forgiven. I can't imagine any more blessed words than for God to look at you and to see all the sin you've ever committed, every evil word, every evil thought, every evil act, every unkind thing you've ever done, and God to say, it doesn't exist anymore. I've forgotten it. It's no longer in the record book. You're clean, you're free, walk away, no charges against you, nothing on your record. And that's what was said to this man. And so the man leaves, and now you'd ask yourself, so how would someone live who's just been forgiven this enormous debt? I mean, wouldn't he be the happiest person that you met? And wouldn't you want him at all your parties? Because he'd just be giddy with excitement and joy that he'd gotten this amazing gift of grace given to him. But instead, it says in verse 28, but that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. That's about maybe 3 months' wages. And he grabs him and says, you pay me what you owe. And the man in verse 29 says exactly the same thing that the first man said. Have mercy, patience with me, and I will pay you all. Now, it was possible to pay back 3 months' wages. It might have taken a little while, but it wasn't impossible to do that. But he needed time. He needed time to work and to save and to be able to pay back the debt. But instead, the first man throws this guy in jail, which, of course, there's no way he can earn money when he's in jail. It means he'll never be able to pay back the debt. You've just prevented him from being able to ever pay you back. And when word comes back to the king that after all the grace that he'd shown the first man, that man had zero grace to show anyone else, the king is furious, and he brings that man before him, and this time he does bring justice on the man. And what amazes the king is after all that he's done, he cannot believe that someone could be so unkind, so ungenerous to someone who owed far less than he had owed. And Jesus was saying that is the story of a lot of Christians. There's a lot of Christians who've been forgiven 10,000 talents, and that ought to drive and affect how they relate to everyone else around them. But what I've discovered is that when Christians talk about grace, we tend to talk about how great it is to receive grace. We love to sing Amazing Grace, saved a wretch like me. And we talk all about what grace has done for me. And when we think about God's grace, we think about the generosity of God who has poured out his grace upon me. But when it comes to us giving grace to other people, suddenly we become grace tightwads. Suddenly, all of a sudden, when it comes to receiving grace, it's like, God, even when I sin against you 1,000 times, you still forgive me. Even after the 1,000th time, you're so kind, you're so generous. But when it comes to forgiving one of our kids for messing up, I'll tell you what, all of a sudden there's not that same attitude toward grace. Well, I told you yesterday to do this, and you haven't done it yet, so I'm lowering down the punishment. Your spouse falls short, and right away we just have no grace for them. Now, we expect God to always have grace for us, but when it comes to giving grace, suddenly it's like, well, I don't think they're sorry enough. They've never apologized. Well, they did this same thing a week ago, so why should I forgive them? And there's an interesting thing, and I think it's important just to realize that that there's a passage in John chapter 1, verse 14, where it talks about Jesus, and it says, he was full of grace and truth. Now, grace never eliminates truth. Grace never says, hey, I mean, you're sinning, you're doing horrible things, but hey, who am I to judge? No, Jesus was full of truth. He always spoke. If you were sinning, he would call it sin. If you were doing something wrong, he would say, no, that's not right. Jesus never tolerated sin, but he at the same time was full of grace. And I think only Jesus probably ever was full of both. We tend to, every person sort of goes somewhere on that pendulum. Some people are pretty high on the grace end, to the point where sometimes they'll tolerate things that are not right. They'll tolerate sin. They'll tolerate abuse. They'll tolerate evil. Jesus never did that. You see, real grace never compromises truth. But at the same time, grace always keeps perspective and says, but after all I've been forgiven, I've got to still be graceful towards you. Grace never compromises. Grace always seeks to make people just like Jesus. But grace also never loses sight of what it's been forgiven itself. And so I think sometimes as Christians, when we're struggling with someone else who's falling short, we need to be careful that we don't ever begin to assume that that's not us. Because sometimes the Spirit of God may just have to quietly whisper into our soul, hey, don't forget, I forgave you 10,000 talents. So if this child is misbehaving, this colleague at work is being difficult to relate to, it doesn't mean you tolerate necessarily. It doesn't mean that you just excuse their bad behavior. But at the same time, you also don't become so bitter and ugly that you begin to act in a way that's not like Jesus. I remember at one point I was speaking at a church, and I'd been speaking there off and on for several months while they were without a pastor. And I had a couple approach me, and when I was writing this book, one day I spoke on some of these truths, and this couple afterward came up to me. They were in tears, and they said, Richard, we're so grateful that you spoke about this today. They said, because we had already decided that at the close of this service, when we went home, we were going to tell our college age or teenage daughter that she had to move out of the house. I said, well, why would you do that? They said, well, because she's just she doesn't have a sense of direction in her life. She graduated from high school, but she's not quite sure about college yet. She's kind of a slob. She leaves messes around the house. She's a bit flighty, doesn't know where she's going, and we're just getting frustrated with her. And so we just felt it would be best just to kind of get serious with her and say, look, you got to grow up, and so you're going to have to move out of the house. I said, well, why were you going to wait till today? They said, well, because she's been on a mission trip for the last 2 weeks to Central America. She loves missions, and she just got back yesterday, so we were waiting until she got back. I said, so your daughter is in church? Yeah, oh yeah, she loves the Lord, she loves missions. So what's the problem? Well, she hasn't been able to pick what major she's going to go in college, not even sure what college she's going to go to. I said, well, that's pretty typical, someone coming right out of high school to not know for sure what they're going to do. That doesn't make them a bad person, does it? It just makes them young, makes them just not yet certain of all of God's leading. But is she praying and seeking God? Oh, yeah. Is she in church? Oh, yeah, she loves church. I said, so all the things that really matter about raising kids, your daughter's doing great. The stuff that she'll grow out of is stuff that you're zeroing in on and getting ready to throw her out of the house for. And this couple just began to weep. And they said, we just can't believe that we could have been so graceless toward a daughter who really has made us proud all of her life. We just get frustrated because she's kind of absent-minded, and she's kind of a bit sloppy, and she doesn't have a real sense of direction. But she loves Jesus, and she loves us, and she loves the church. And so they looked at that, and they just said, we just can't believe that we could have been so graceless. And I had to just say, well, you know what? We all struggle with that. We all have a tendency to lose sight of what God has done for us, and all of a sudden we can become so demanding of others. Maybe one last thing just to say about that today. There's much now in this book. I kind of look at just different ways that people can be gracious toward people, toward strangers, toward family, toward people in the church. You know, the sad thing is sometimes in the church, people can be far less gracious to people than you'd expect. I mean, the church ought to be the most gracious place on the planet because it's filled with people who've all been forgiven 10,000 talents. And yet oftentimes churches can be some of the most critical places, some of the most unkind and unforgiving places. And that's because Christians forget how much they've been forgiven. You can always tell someone when they're not gracious toward others, you can always tell that they must have forgotten how much they've been forgiven. Because there's no way you could know how much you're forgiven and then be chintzy about how you forgive others. There's just a wonderful passage, perhaps just to leave with you this morning. It's found in Ephesians 4:29, and you know this passage, and most of the first part of it is something that's quite famous, and we typically focus on this. But Ephesians 4, verse 29, it says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." So when we look at this passage, we tend to look at what we're not supposed to say. Well, don't let any corrupt word. That really means that word corrupt is actually a word that could mean sewage. And if you think about sewage, garbage, just disgusting stuff, it's saying don't ever, for any reason, let that kind of word come out of your mouth. And so we tend to focus on that, to say, so don't curse, don't swear, don't tell unclean jokes and that kind of thing. But often what we miss is the second part. It says, but say things that are good for edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers. Now, what is grace? Grace is an undeserved gift. Grace gives life. Grace brings forgiveness. Grace makes people like Jesus. That's why God relates to us in grace. And what this is saying is, every time you open your mouth, you have the opportunity to impart an undeserved gift to someone else. Or you can open your mouth and let sewage come out. Have you ever had people like that? After you talked to them, you felt as if you just walked under a pipe that had sewage coming out and you just felt unclean. Some conversations afterward, you just think, oh my word, I just wish I had not heard any of that. And yet there's other people, they can just catch you in the church lobby, or they can just see you at work, and with just a handful of sentences, they just lift up your spirit. They're just a gift to your soul. And I've often thought to myself, well, Lord, why would I ever let sewage come out of my mouth when I could have given someone a gift of your grace? I could have spoken a word that made them more like Jesus. And so whenever I look at Ephesians 4:29, I oftentimes have to just pray and say, God, as I go out into today, I pray that every time I open my mouth, I'm imparting a gift to somebody. I'm lifting them up. I'm encouraging them. I'm lifting their spirit. That's what grace does. It could choose to point out what was wrong. It could choose to point out the shortfalls, or it could choose to make people more like Jesus. Well, let me just close by saying we've got a question here from Connie, saying, I've heard many definitions of forgiveness. What is a Christian's definition of forgiveness? And I'm not trying to give you a Christian's definition of forgiveness, but certainly in the Bible, forgiveness would be to release any debt owed to you by someone else because of what they've done to you. That's kind of the story here in this parable, is basically saying, I forgive what you owe me. When people harm you, they incur a debt. They're obligated now to pay back what they've done, what they've taken from you. Forgiveness says, you don't owe me anything. I won't hold anything against you. Now, I've had people say, well, I forgive, but I won't forget. In other words, I'm going to keep holding this over your head. I'm going to keep reminding you of what you did. That's not forgiveness. Forgiveness says, I don't remember it anymore. Now, it doesn't mean you can erase your memory banks, but what that means is I'm not going to hold on to it anymore. I'm not going to put it in your face anymore. I'm not going to meditate upon it and kind of hold on to my grudges and rehearse all the hurt that you've done me. I'm releasing it. And of course, when you release and you forgive someone, it sets you free. I've known people that held on to unforgiveness for years, and it actually hurt the victim more than it hurt the person who committed the crime. People that just were so angry at how someone spoke to them and treated them that 10 years later they're still filled with bitterness because of how someone treated them. And I would say that's the classic example of that is someone saying, I'm mad at you, so I'm going to keep drinking poison to hurt you. It doesn't work that way. And when you don't forgive someone, it's as if you keep drinking poison because you're so angry at what someone else did. But forgiveness says, I'm releasing you. I'm not obligating you in any way. You're not in debt to me anymore. I don't want that bondage. I don't want that chain around my neck because I'm holding on with anger to what you've done to me. That's what forgiveness is. And I'll tell you what, it's impossible to do that in your own strength. That's where you need the grace of God. The grace of God gives people what they don't deserve. And forgiveness is something people don't deserve, but grace gives it anyway. Forgiveness is one of the great examples of what grace will do. And so as you go into today, let me just encourage you, use your words to impart grace today. And don't forget how much God's forgiven you. So when you begin to get impatient with someone else, stop and think of how patient God has been with you, how long-suffering God has been towards you. And that might help you just be inspired to be like Jesus to the people around you as well. Be a person of grace. And next week, I want us to begin talking about when God speaks. We'll be back on Tuesday morning as we normally are. And I want to just spend a couple of weeks talking to you about how to recognize God's voice. I've had many people say, well, God's never spoken to me. But oftentimes you begin to realize, well, you know what? I think he has been speaking. I just think you haven't recognized his voice. So we'll look at how to recognize God's voice because that is certainly the most important voice you'll ever hear. So I look forward to being with you next week, and I hope you have a great week imparting grace to everyone around you.